Hey everybody, today I am going to be reviewing American Beauty. This film came out in 1999 and it was directed by Sam Mendes. He's not a director that I bring up at all, really, on this channel, but this was his directorial debut and it was quite a successful debut at that. This film, at the time of its release, was acclaimed by critics all over the country, and many considered it to be the film of the year. It came out, of course, in 1999, which was a very significant year, signaling the end of one century and into the next. And like most entertainment, you see a lot of that reflected in the work, and I think that's very true in the case of the film American Beauty. Because in the 90s, it was kind of an interesting time. It's a time where you're not really sure what to call it. It was kind of a time when there was like a hangover over, the kind of the excess of the 1980s. The materialism, the Reagan era, all of that. And then here we see a generation sort of sagging after all of that. It isn't hair gel and cocaine and hookers on Wall Street anymore. Now it's the next decade and we've transitioned to a quieter place in our lives. We are in the suburbs. We're having a midlife crisis and an existential crisis. It's the boredom that one settles in once you've gone through the motions of that social structure that is America. We saw a lot of that in 1999. We saw a lot of images of unsatisfied protagonists in cubicles with 5 o'clock shadow. It's a world where male protagonists especially are having trouble finding their purpose in the world. They're not hunters and soldiers and gatherers anymore. That primal need has been trumped by society at this point. We have technology now. We have all of these jobs where you can kill people from behind a computer screen, in a sense. So now there's just that constant struggle, and that was a theme that we saw that was quite prominent in a very popular film like Fight Club. Those are the themes of existential angst and fighting the corporate system, and that was also a prominent theme in The Matrix as well. Both came out in 1999. I've reviewed both films in the past, and they're quite important films. I think much more important for the world than American Beauty was. But the reason I want to focus on this particular film today is because it fascinates me in a very different way than those other two films do. It fascinates me because of how it was able to, I guess, touch a nerve with critics at the time. It was the winner of Best Picture at the Academy Awards in the year 2000. Now, I normally, as you probably have figured out, I hate the Oscars, I hate talking about them, but I think in this case it's kind of important to the overall kind of arc of the American Beauty success story. Of course, we know that the Oscars aren't about art. I mean, the idea of it being a competition kind of ruins that immediately. But it's also about politics. It's media notoriety, and a Best Picture doesn't necessarily mean that the entire American public or even the Academy or critics all think that it is the best picture. But as I said, it's political. So it's like selecting something that can be the poster for how America wants to be perceived, just in terms of its pop culture, is very important. American Beauty is quite perplexing for me in that sense. I can't understand why America felt the need to be perceived through this sort of symbol. Some people still praise this movie a lot, and some people still hail it as a masterwork, but I don't feel that way, and for me, it doesn't hold up very well at all. And I think with each passing year, you notice more and more detractors. It's a film that to me thinks it's extremely self-aware, but isn't self-aware at all, and that dichotomy is really interesting. I will, of course, like I usually do, I'll talk about the things that I do like about the film before I talk about more of the things I dislike. And I think it's really important to talk about the good things about this movie, because it is very easy to write them off because this movie is considered overhyped and overrated or just bad. But I do think that there are aspects of the film that to me have a lot of merit and do deserve praise, and one of those things would be the cinematography, the way that the film is shot. Just in terms of the way that the film looks, it is very rich and it looks very expensive, very cinematic. It is just beautiful, beautiful shots, very intoxicating and hypnotic. And there are just really beautiful compositions. I think that even though the symbolism within those shots are quite hackneyed and blatant, still the composition itself to me is quite sophisticated regardless of that. And there are a lot of shots in this movie, surprisingly, that do stick with me. And I think I've stuck with a lot of people. The film was shot by Conrad Hall, who was a legend in the biz back in the day, and he shot tons and tons of films, but he did shoot one of my favorite films of its period, American films, in the late 60s, and that's In Cold Blood. And at the time, back when I was like a teenager, I just thought that the compositions and the black and white, the contrast and all that was just the most impeccable from that film. He really has a grasp of the film just in terms of what it's trying to convey more emotionally. He really does capture kind of a mature balance of all of the film's themes, and he transitions really beautifully between the mundane lifestyles of the main characters of people like Lester, and then it goes so seamlessly into these surreal dream sequences that are sprinkled throughout. Another thing that I do feel is really of note is just the overall structure with it. I'm not crazy about the structure, maybe more in detail in certain areas, but I'll get to that a little bit later. But I will say overall, it is a very tightly constructed script. There isn't a lot of fat to trim, and I think that's a really good thing. Most of the scenes do work towards the payoff of the film, and it does have kind of a nice climax that builds into that third act. But honestly, that is about it. That's really the only things that I could find that I really admired about American Beauty overall, returning to it as an adult. This is one of those movies, it's like watching Crash, though not that bad. It's like watching Crash again after so many years and being like, am I in the Twilight Zone? Because like, I hate that film. And I really don't like American Beauty, and I'm just amazed that it captured so much attention at the time. This is the kind of film that like I would see still images of American Beauty in my film books back when I was in college. And I don't know, it's just, I guess I shouldn't be surprised because I feel this way about a lot of things that are popular and I don't really like them. But this one, for whatever reason, just it's kind of like a splinter in my mind right now. A lot of times when I'm watching a movie, a word will stick out to me as something that I keep kind of repeating over and over in terms of how I feel about the movie. And with this film, that word was template. And that's all I could think of throughout, because that's what this film feels like. It just feels like a very simple template. It's a shallow and very empty portrait of American life seen through the eyes of somebody that doesn't really understand the darkness, I think, that emanates from underneath all of that. It wants to show us a slice of that American dream or that American life and how it is merely a facade for a more sinister center. And that is explored through satire, which is common enough. We see that all the time. But in the case of this film, to me, it's completely drained of any sort of originality or anything about it that is unique. It's basically like a retelling of Lolita if you took away all of the wit and the complexity. Every symbol and every character is so paint by the numbers that it's a little bit shocking. You have the male protagonist in his midlife crisis. He needs an awakening. That's fine. You see that a lot. He has a wife that is really uptight and sort of manic and calculated. But deep down, she's very lonely and sad. And of course, there has to be a scene where they show that so you can feel the sympathy. And of course, my favorite would have to be Chris Cooper as the guy, the retired Marine, just because he's so stereotypical. He's, like very strict and violent, masculine and unwavering. But all of that prowess is just a cover up for the fact that maybe he might have homosexual feelings. The obvious kind of symbolism of rose petals that you see throughout the film, the image of Carolyn hugging all of the clothes in her closet and crying, the song choice of American Woman, it's just like, you couldn't be more cookie cutter. Yes, it is a satire, so yes, it can kind of play with the idea of being cliche and overt to an extent. But this sort of cheekiness does not have any irony or anything clever about it. It's like it was written by a dad who thinks that all of a sudden he's hip and can hang with his kids because he listens to Aerosmith and AC/DC, and it's like, no. So let's talk about Lester as a character who is played by Kevin Spacey, who, is America's favorite dad. He is the person who ties the entire film together. He is an upper middle class magazine executive that is just, slogging through life as you might expect. One day blends into the next for him. He's really bored. He's unfulfilled. He hates his wife, Carolyn. He doesn't have a great relationship with his daughter like he used to. And like I mentioned, he's looking for that reawakening in that sense, the freedom from the ego, if you will. Everyone is always looking for an ego death and for a way to put everything you have and want and know on the line. It's only in those moments that you truly grow the most. And that sort of ego death can only be achieved if you're facing death. which is really what happens. So what does he do? He begins to completely change his lifestyle, and he begins to partake in activities and lifestyles of the youth. And in this case, the youth would mainly be probably millennials with their liberal ideals and woke sense of self. He befriends Ricky, who is his teenage next door neighbor, who is this pot-smoking pseudo-intellectual that is straight out of a parody. This is such a poorly written character. It's pretty unbelievable. But Lester's really impressed with this kid and all of his deep insights, and also he's just really impressed that the kid is into Pink Floyd. He's like, no way, you listen to Pink Floyd? And it's like, yeah, like everyone else. They're such an underrated band, I know. Lester buys weed from him, he quits his job and decides to work in the fast food industry. He starts working out incessantly because he is lusting after his daughter's best friend, who is the blonde cheerleader. But the thing about Lester is that his arc, for me at least, is completely unfulfilling in the long run, because there is really no personal evolution or growth that has any depth, or even any commentary seemingly of depth. It's not that he wants to be woke, he wants to be lazy. He still wants to live like it's the 1970s, which is fine. I'm all about that life. I would much prefer it to the life that he is living currently in the film. But the thing is he can't really do that. He has a house and he has a responsibility to his family, or he should. And that responsibility should be the crux of his growth, in my opinion, but it's not. One could argue that this is really what that's about, that this is a portrait of just shallow living and shallow Americans, because it is true. I mean, most of us do want to have that bohemian lifestyle, and we glamorize that life without really understanding the consequences of it. There is a lot of sacrifice involved, and that's where a lot of the growth comes from. Of course, he bribes his previous employer into giving him like I think a year's salary covered, but in the midst of that, he's working in fast food, which really means that he's still another cog in the machine, just in a very different way. And to me, I'm looking at this and I'm like, minimum wage jobs are nothing to scoff at. That's a lot of hard work. But that's what makes a compelling protagonist for me, is sacrifice. And without sacrifice, without realizing your responsibility as a father and as a husband, you become stagnant in terms of your motivations. If I want to bring it back to Lolita, because again, they are so similar, you could look at Humbert, who's the protagonist in Lolita, and he also begins to run away from his responsibilities, and he just digs himself deeper and deeper into this hole as he literally leaves the American dream behind to be able to fulfill this fantasy with this young girl. But it's his spiral downward that becomes the symbol, and that is where the meaning comes from. And there's nothing like that in this film. At the moment of his death, he's happy. And I understand the intent behind that, because as I said, there's that ego death. In the words of Tyler Durden, it's only after you've lost everything that you're free to do anything. But here I feel completely unsatisfied by it, because thematically, the reasons are unfulfilling for why he's smiling, which to me makes this whole like enlightenment, achievement of enlightenment kind of dead in the water in terms of a payoff. I feel like he doesn't really gain much in terms of his own actions, other than realizing, you know, maybe I shouldn't have sex with my daughter's underage best friend. This film, to me, does not have the balls to dig into what it really should be revealing, and instead just uses very easy kind of stand-ins, cliche stand-ins, in order to communicate that. And really, when you look closer at it, even though it looks beautiful from afar, look closer, it's just the whole film is on faulty ground, and not just in terms of the ending either. One thing that really bothers me is the beginning, and the film begins with Jane, who's talking to Ricky about how she's annoyed that her dad is lusting after her best friend naturally. She's mad because she's jealous. She wants his attention because he doesn't really give it to her. And Ricky asks her, do you want me to kill him? And she says, yes. The screen goes black, and then you see the title, American Beauty. And then the film starts after that opening scene. Now that is a scene that comes back from later in the movie, which you can probably suspect if it's your first time watching it. But right off the bat, it is setting us up for something that is not going to pay off. And of course, we learn that the kid was just kidding, and the whole point of it is really anticlimactic. But why do it then? Other than to really throw us off and manipulate us in a way to make us think that this character, this peeping Tom creeper with a character, has some sort of sinister, murderous intentions. When really it's the Marine father who ends up killing him just because he, you know, likes boys. It's a red herring that to me has no thematic ground to stand on, and all it does is make me feel like I've been cheated. To me, this film is so empty. but the real movie starts at the very end when he gets shot. To me, that should be the opening scene. And then we go from there. There are so many loose ends that need to be tied up with that ending. There are so many interesting questions that arise from that ending. That situation, the stakes are very high, naturally. And I feel like you could really reveal a lot there. You could really see the ugliness of Americans and the system by how they deal with such a situation. For instance, what happens to Carolyn? You know, she had a gun and she presumably was going to go kill her husband, but somebody beat her to the punch. So she's got this gun, she wants to hide it. What happens to her? To me, that's just the very beginning of opening that character up in a really, really interesting direction. But I want to know, now that she's alone, where does she go from here? How does she explain herself? What happens to Angela, the underage cheerleader best friend? What happens to Jane and Ricky is a very interesting one, because they walk in, you know, they're gonna run off together. They see Lester dead and they just kind of shrug it off and go, oh, well, sucks for him. And then they just run away. That seems weird. That seems very suspicious already. So it's like you've got a lot of things here, a lot of moving parts that could really show a character's true colors and really show their true motivations and their growth and how that could be revealed. Either they will rise to the occasion or unravel. And that really is the story of the American dream anyway. But no, this movie feels really just like one big kind of step-by-step how to write a very basic American suburban satire. And we've seen it done so much better, so many times before and so many times since. We have a character who really doesn't do anything to be able to achieve what he wants at the end of his life. And then when he does reach that personal enlightenment, he hasn't really made peace with anything truly. He never really made peace with his daughter or anybody in his life. And now all of a sudden he's this all-knowing person because he's no longer amongst the living, and so he's just kind of hovering above all of the neighborhoods. So they're literally above us, condescending to us, saying like, one day you'll understand. And it's like, dude, like that is the most shallow interpretation of the afterlife. The writer who wrote this does not know shit, just like I don't know shit, just like Lester does not know shit. And this kind of pretentious filmmaking to me is just, it is ignorant and obnoxious, which to me is a sad combination when you think you're saying something really smart, but you're not. I wanted so badly watching this film for something to grip me, for something to mean something, for the story to open up in complex directions, and it just never even remotely came close to that. Everything was just so, yeah, paint by the numbers. As it stands, of course, feelings can change, but mine really just seemed to get worse and worse when it comes to this film. Yeah, I mean, overall, to me, it's snobby, it's lazy, it's self-important, and worst of all, it is ignorant to its own irony, at least I think. By seemingly claiming to know all of the answers to all of this frustration and societal repression, to me, it proves just how hypocritical the film truly is. And I'm just really amazed that even after all this time, it's still somewhat considered a classic. I see it kind of merely as kind of like a lame fragment of the zeitgeist that was clear enough and beautiful looking enough at the time that it may have hypnotized people just kind of at first glance. But it just does not hold up at all. And I would recommend so many other different American satire films or suburban satires over this one. And that is my review. Thank you all for listening. All of my social media information is below. You can watch more videos here and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.